The sky turned black on a Tuesday morning when the first ships appeared above Earth. And nobody who saw them would ever forget the way the sun vanished behind metal and shadow. General Amara Okonkwo stood in the command center beneath the Swiss Alps and watched the screens fill with images that made her stomach turn cold. And she knew in that moment that everything humanity had built over thousands of years meant nothing against what floated above their world. The Vithric Dominion had come without warning and without mercy. And their fleet of 3,000 warships spread across the planet like a disease covering healthy skin. They were tall creatures with bodies like insects and eyes that held no warmth or curiosity. And they had conquered 11 species across the stars before they found Earth. Their method was always the same. And it had never failed them in 3 centuries of expansion across the galaxy. First came the display of power. Then came the demand for surrender. And finally came the culling of any who refused to kneel. The Vithric commander called himself Hegemon Vreth. And when he broadcast his message to every screen and speaker on Earth, his voice carried the confidence of someone who had never known defeat. "People of this world," he said and translated words that crackled through damaged satellites. "You have 72 hours to surrender your governments and your weapons and your will to the Vithric Dominion. And if you do not comply, we will reduce your population to a number we find acceptable for labor purposes." The world leaders tried to respond with unity. But unity was hard to find when fire fell from the sky. The first kinetic strikes hit 6 cities within hours of the deadline passing. And the Vithric did not use bombs or flames but simply dropped heavy objects from orbit at speeds that turned buildings into dust and dust into nothing. Moscow vanished in a flash of light and debris that could be seen from space. And 12 million people stopped existing between one heartbeat and the next snowfall followed. Then Cairo, then Mumbai. And each strike was calculated to cause maximum death with minimum effort. The message was clear. The Vithric did not want to destroy Earth because they wanted its resources and its people for their empire. But they had no problem killing billions to make the survivors more obedient. General Okonkwo watched the casualty reports climb past 100 million in the first week, and she felt something inside her chest growing tight and cold. The nuclear response came on the 5th day when the remaining world governments agreed to launch everything they had at the alien fleet. And for a brief moment, the sky lit up with the fury of 1,000 suns. It did nothing. The Vithric shields absorbed the blast like a lake, absorbing raindrops. And Hegemon Vreth broadcast a second message that carried what might have been amusement in his alien voice. "Your weapons are primitive," he said, "and your resistance is expected but pointless. So, I will give you 48 more hours to accept reality before I order the next phase of correction." The world began to fall apart in ways that had nothing to do with alien weapons governments, collapsed under the weight of impossible choices. And leaders who had spent their lives seeking power suddenly found that power meant nothing when death came from the stars. Riots erupted in every major city that still stood. And people killed each other for food and water, and the simple comfort of having someone to blame religious movements exploded overnight as millions searched for meaning in the apocalypse. And some prayed for salvation while others welcomed the end. Suicide rates climbed so high that hospitals stopped counting. And the Vithric had not even landed their ground forces yet, in her bunker beneath the mountains. Amara Okonkwo received reports from commanders who had stopped following orders and soldiers who had abandoned their posts and civilians, who had formed armed gangs that answered to no one, her aid. A young captain named Thomas Chun brought her coffee that had gone cold hours ago and asked the question that everyone was thinking, but nobody wanted to say out loud. "General, what do we do now?" Amara stared at the screens showing cities burning and people dying and aliens, waiting patiently for humanity to finish breaking itself. and she felt the weight of 8 billion lives pressing down on her shoulders. She had trained for war her entire life. But nothing in her training had prepared her for an enemy that could swat nuclear missiles from the sky like insects. She had led soldiers into battle on 3 continents, but she had never faced a situation where fighting meant certain death and surrender, meant slavery. The old rules no longer applied, and the old strategies were worthless against an enemy that played a completely different game. "We cannot win," she said slowly, and the words tasted like ash in her mouth. Captain Chun nodded because he already knew this truth. "We cannot surrender either," Amara continued, "because surrender means the end of everything we are, and our children will be slaves, and their children will forget what freedom ever meant." She turned away from the screens and looked at the young captain with eyes that had seen too much death in too few days. "So what is left?" she asked, and the question hung in the air between them like smoke from a dying fire outside the bunker. The world continued to crack and splinter and fall apart, and humanity stumbled toward a darkness that seemed to have no end. But somewhere in that darkness, something was beginning to stir, something old and fierce and utterly human that the Vithric had never encountered in all their centuries of conquest. The aliens had come to break Earth, but they did not understand that breaking was not the same as destroying. They did not understand that humans had survived ice ages and plagues and wars that killed millions. And they had survived not by being strong, but by being stubborn beyond all reason. They did not understand that when you push a human to the edge of extinction, something happens that cannot be predicted or controlled. Hegemon Vreth watched the chaos below and felt satisfied that the conquest was proceeding as expected, and he began planning the occupation that would follow the inevitable. Surrender. He had no way of knowing that surrender would never come. He had no way of knowing that humanity was about to do something that no conquered species had ever done before. They were about to crack in a way that would change everything. The breaking happened without warning and without planning, and it spread across the world like wildfire, jumping from tree to tree in a dry forest. It started in small ways that nobody noticed at first. A soldier who stopped following orders not because he was afraid, but because he no longer believed in the authority giving them. A government official who walked away from her desk and never came back. A police officer who threw his badge into the river and went home to hold his children. Within days, the small cracks became huge fractures, and the systems that had held human civilization together for centuries simply stopped working. Money became worthless because nobody believed in it anymore. And banks closed their doors because there was nothing inside worth protecting. Governments issued commands that nobody followed. And presidents and prime ministers found themselves talking to empty rooms while their nations dissolved. Around them, the Vithric watched from orbit with growing confusion as their carefully planned conquest fell apart in ways they had never seen before. Hegemon Vreth demanded reports from his intelligence officers, and the reports made no sense to him. "The humans are not surrendering," one officer told him, "but they are also not fighting in any organized way we can identify or counter." "Then, what are they doing?" Vreth asked with irritation creeping into his voice. "They appear to be abandoning their social structures entirely," the officer said, "and we are detecting no central authority left to negotiate with or threaten. This was not how conquest was supposed to work." And Vreth had conquered enough worlds to know the pattern by heart. First, the target species would resist with their military forces, and those forces would be destroyed. Then the target species would negotiate through their leaders, and those leaders would be given terms of surrender. Finally, the target species would submit and become part of the Dominion, and order would be restored under Vithric control. But humanity had skipped the second and third steps entirely. And Vreth found himself facing something his military training had never prepared him for. An enemy with no leaders to kill, and no government to topple, and no structure to break down on the surface. The chaos continued to grow, but it was changing into something strange and unexpected. Dr. Yusuf Nazari was a quantum physicist who had spent his life studying particles too small to see. And when the invasion began, he had locked himself in his laboratory and refused to leave. His colleagues had fled or died or given up. But Yusuf kept working, because working was the only thing that kept the fear from swallowing him whole. On the 12th day of the invasion, while the world burned outside his windows, he made a discovery that would change everything. The Vithric shields operated on a specific energy frequency, and human-made graphene composites could absorb that frequency like a sponge absorbing water. It was not a weapon, but it was the beginning of one. And Yusuf knew he had to share it with everyone he could reach. In the old world, he would have filed a report and waited for approval and followed the proper channels. But the old world was dead, and the proper channels no longer existed. Instead, he uploaded his findings to every server and website and message board he could find. And within hours, his discovery was spreading across what remained of the internet, 1,000 kilometers away in Seoul. A teenage girl named Ji-won Park sat in her family's basement and studied the data that Yusuf had released. She had been building electronic devices since she was 8 years old, and her mind worked in ways that adults often found strange and wonderful. Within 2 days, she had designed a portable MP device that could disable Vithric ground drones. And she uploaded the blueprints to the same networks that had carried Yusuf's discovery. In Buenos Aires, an old engineer named Carlos Mendez figured out how to hijack Vithric communication frequencies. And he shared that knowledge too in Lagos. A chemistry teacher discovered that common household chemicals could be combined to create a gas that corroded Vithric armor. And she posted instructions that anyone could follow. The knowledge spread like seeds in the wind. And everywhere it landed, something new began to grow. The humans were not organizing in any way the Vithric could understand or predict. But they were connecting and sharing and learning from each other in ways that had no central control. General Okonkwo emerged from her bunker 3 weeks after the invasion began. And she found a world she barely recognized. The old military command structure had collapsed completely. But in its place, something new was rising. Small groups of fighters who called themselves cells and operated without orders from anyone. They attacked Vithric patrols using weapons built from garbage and knowledge, pulled from the shattered internet. And when one cell was destroyed, 2 more appeared to take its place. Amara met with other survivors in the ruins of Geneva. And she found soldiers and civilians and scientists and children all working together without rank or hierarchy. "We have no army," a former corporal told her. "But we have something better. We have everyone." The Vithric landed their ground forces expecting to occupy a defeated planet. But instead, they found themselves walking into a nightmare. Every street was dangerous, and every building could hide an ambush. And every human face could belong to someone who wanted to kill them. They could not tell fighters from civilians, because the difference had stopped existing. And they could not negotiate peace, because there was no one with authority to make peace. Hegemon Vreth received a report that made his blood run cold. The humans were not fighting a war. They were fighting a million tiny wars all at once. And the Dominion had no strategy for dealing with such chaos. "They have gone insane," his advisor said with something like fear in his voice. Vreth watched footage of a human woman charging a Vithric patrol with nothing but a sharp piece of metal and a wild smile on her face. And she died within seconds, but 3 more humans emerged from hiding to continue the attack. "No," he said slowly as understanding began to dawn. "They have not gone insane. They have become something we have never faced before." He paused and watched more footage of humans fighting and dying and refusing to stop no matter how many of them fell. "They have become unpredictable," he said. and that may be more dangerous than any weapon. The war for Earth had only just begun, and the Vithric were starting to realize that they had made a terrible mistake. They had come to break humanity. But humanity had broken first, and the broken pieces were sharp enough to cut. 3 months after the invasion began, the Vithric controlled nothing but the ground beneath their feet and the air above their ships. Their armies had landed on every continent, expecting to march through ruined cities and accept the surrender of broken populations. But instead they found themselves trapped in a war that had no front lines, and no safe zones and no end in sight. Hegemon Vreth stood in his command center and stared at maps that showed Vithric positions scattered across the planet like islands in a hostile sea. Every garrison was under constant attack, and every patrol that left secured areas risked being destroyed before it returned. The humans had given themselves a name that spread through whispers and graffiti and songs. They called themselves the Swarm, and the name fit perfectly because they moved and attacked and thought like a single organism made of billions of individual parts. General Amara Okonkwo had become one of many leaders who guided the Swarm without commanding it. And she understood now that the old ways of war had died forever. She met with other resistance fighters in a collapsed subway tunnel beneath what had once been Paris. And they shared information and strategies without any hierarchy telling them what to do. There was Marcus, a former banker who now specialized in disrupting Vithric supply lines using nothing but patience and homemade explosives. There was Priya, a doctor who had turned her medical knowledge toward understanding Vithric biology and finding weaknesses in their armor. There was old Carlos from Buenos Aires who had walked 2,000 kilometers to share his knowledge of alien communications, and young G1 who had done the same from Seoul with her EMP designs. They did not take orders from Amara, and she did not give them orders. They simply talked and shared and agreed on what needed to be done. And then they went back to their own cells and did it. The Vithric keep trying to find our headquarters, Marcus said with a grim smile. But they cannot find something that does not exist. They keep trying to kill our leaders, Priya added. But when every human is a leader, killing becomes impossible. The Swarm had developed tactics that no military academy had ever taught because no military academy had ever imagined. A war like this, a Vithric patrol might be walking through a ruined street when suddenly an old woman would throw acid from a balcony above them while they dealt with her. Children would roll glass bottles filled with combustible liquid beneath their vehicles while they dealt with the fire. A sniper would fire a single shot from a building 3 kilometers away and then vanish before anyone could respond. And while they searched for the sniper, another group would attack from a completely different direction, using completely different weapons. The attacks were small and seemed random, but they never stopped day and night. Hour after hour, the Swarm bit and stung, and bled the Vithric forces in 1,000 tiny wounds that could not be healed. The aliens responded with increasing brutality, because brutality was the only tool they understood. They destroyed entire neighborhoods suspected of harboring resistance fighters. But this only created more fighters from the survivors who had lost everything. They executed prisoners in public displays meant to frighten the population into submission. But the executions only made the Swarm angrier and more determined. They deployed chemical weapons that killed thousands of humans at once. But for every human who died, 10 more picked up weapons and joined the fight. Hegemon Vreth received reports that his forces were suffering casualties at rates that no occupation had ever experienced. And he began to understand that something fundamental had gone wrong with this conquest. We have conquered 11 species, he told his advisors, and all of them had the same basic structure: leaders and followers, rulers and subjects, those who gave orders and those who obeyed. He gestured at the screen showing chaos spreading across every continent. The humans had this structure too, but they abandoned it when we arrived, and now we are fighting an enemy that cannot be decapitated because it has no head. One advisor suggested increasing the violence even further, but Vreth shook his head. Every time we increase the violence, their resistance grows stronger. It is as if they feed on death and pain and turn it into fuel for their fight. He paused and considered his next words carefully. I am beginning to think that we made a strategic error in attacking this species, and I must report our situation to the High Council. For the first time in his long career, Hegemon Vreth sent a message to his superiors admitting that he might not be able to complete his mission. Request immediate reinforcements, he wrote, and advised that the human species does not respond to standard conquest protocols. They may be ungovernable by any means available to the Dominion. Down on the surface, Amara emerged from the tunnel and looked up at the stars that were visible through gaps in the smoke and dust that covered the sky. She knew that the Vithric would send more ships and more soldiers, and she knew that the fight would only get harder from here. But she also knew something that the aliens did not understand. The swarm was not just a military strategy, but a transformation of humanity itself. They had been broken by the invasion, but the breaking had set them free from the chains of civilization that had held them back for thousands of years. They were no longer citizens of nations or members of social classes or followers of leaders. They were simply humans fighting for survival with every tool and trick and desperate measure they could imagine. And humans, Amara had learned, were very good at surviving when everything else had been taken away. Let them send their reinforcements, she whispered to the uncaring stars, and we will teach them what it means to fight a species that has nothing left to lose. The war was far from over, but the Vithric had already lost something they could never recover, the certainty that they would win, and in war. Amara knew certainty was worth more than any weapon. The reinforcements arrived 6 months after the invasion began, and for a moment the humans who watched the sky felt their hope waver and crack. 2,000 new warships joined the fleet in orbit, and fresh legions of Vethric soldiers descended to the surface in dropships that darkened the sky like metal rain. But the Dominion had sent something else too, something far more dangerous than soldiers or ships. They were called the Mindbreakers, and they were the most feared weapon in the Vithric arsenal. These specialists had evolved psychic abilities over millions of years, and they could reach into the minds of other species and break their will to resist like snapping a dry twig. They had shattered the courage of entire civilizations, turning fierce warriors into obedient slaves with nothing but the power of their thoughts. The High Council had decided that conventional military force could not conquer humanity, so they would conquer human minds instead. The Mindbreakers landed at Vithric bases across the planet and immediately began their work. And at first the results seemed promising. They captured resistance fighters and probed their thoughts, looking for the leaders of the swarm. But what they found inside human minds confused and disturbed them. Their consciousness is fractured. The lead Mindbreaker reported to Hegemon Vreth with something like unease in her voice. And we cannot find the structures we normally use to break a species. There is no central authority they believe in and no hierarchy we can collapse, then break their individual wills, Vreth commanded, and make them slaves one by one if necessary. The Mindbreaker tried to explain what she had found, but the words were difficult because nothing in her experience had prepared her for human minds. When we enter their thoughts, she said slowly, we find chaos, not the chaos of madness, but the chaos of a storm, constantly moving and changing and refusing to be still. She paused and searched for better words. Other species have minds like buildings with foundations we can destroy. But human minds are like water. We can push against them, but we cannot break them because they simply flow around our attacks and reform into new shapes. Vreth did not understand and did not care about understanding. He only wanted results. "Keep trying," he ordered, "and use whatever methods are necessary." The mindbreakers tried, and they kept trying for weeks. But their efforts only confirmed what the lead mindbreaker had reported. Human minds were too chaotic to grip, and too stubborn to crush, and too strange to predict. Worse, the psychic attacks seemed to make some humans more resistant rather than less, as if the experience of having their minds invaded only strengthened their determination to fight one captured resistance fighter. A young man named David, who had been a teacher before the invasion, laughed out loud when the mindbreaker tried to break him. "You want to know our secret?" he asked, with blood running down his face from the strain of the psychic assault. "We were already broken before you got here, broken by our own history and our own fears and our own endless capacity for suffering." He smiled despite the pain. "You cannot break what is already broken, and you cannot kill what has already died. We died the day your ships appeared, and what you are fighting now is something that crawled out of our graves." The mindbreaker withdrew from his mind with a shudder and refused to try again. Meanwhile, the swarm had been evolving and growing stronger with every passing month. Dr. Nazari's graphene discovery had been refined into portable devices that could pierce Vithric shields at close range. Once MP designs had been upgraded into weapons that could crash dropships from the sky. Engineers working in hidden laboratories had reverse-engineered captured Vithric technology and created weapons that the aliens had never faced before. But the greatest change was not in weapons or tactics. It was in the humans themselves. The breaking that had happened in the early days of the invasion had transformed humanity in ways that nobody had predicted. Fear was still there, but it no longer controlled them. Instead, it had become fuel for their fight. The voice inside their heads that told them to submit and survive had gone silent. And what remained was something older and fiercer that had been sleeping since humanity first walked out of Africa with stone tools and stubborn hearts. Samara met with swarm leaders in a bombed-out cathedral and outlined the next phase of their resistance. The Vithric came here thinking they would face nations and armies and command structures they could destroy, she said. But instead they found a species that went insane together and turned our insanity into a weapon. She looked around at the scarred and weary faces of the people who had become her family over the past months. They sent their mindbreakers to crush our will. But our will was already shattered, and the pieces have become blades that cut their psychics when they try to touch. She stood and raised her voice so everyone could hear. "Now we show them what happens when broken humans decide to fight back with everything they have left." Operation Hydra began at midnight on every continent. And it was not a coordinated attack, because coordination was impossible for the swarm. Instead, it was a synchronized attack. Every cell that could fight chose the same moment to strike. And the effect was devastating. Thousands of attacks hit Vithric positions simultaneously. And the alien forces found themselves overwhelmed by an enemy that seemed to be everywhere at once. Bases that had been secure for months suddenly faced assaults from directions that should have been impossible. Patrols that had been routine suddenly became death traps. The Vithric's superior technology meant nothing when they could not predict where the next attack would come from or how many enemies they would face. The reinforcements that the High Council had sent began to suffer casualties at rates that shocked the Dominion leadership. "We are losing," Hegemon Vreth admitted to himself for the first time, "and I do not know how to stop it." The mindbreakers sent their final report before requesting evacuation from the surface. "We cannot break these humans," they wrote, "because their minds are already broken in ways that make them immune to our powers. They have turned their psychological damage into armor, and we cannot penetrate it." The war had entered a new phase. And for the first time since the invasion began, the Vithric were afraid. 1 year after the invasion began, Hegemon Vreth stood on the bridge of his flagship and watched his empire's greatest defeat unfold on the planet below. The Vithric Dominion had conquered 11 species across the Orion Arm, and they had never failed until now. Earth was still burning in places, and the human population had been cut in half by war and starvation and disease. But the survivors refused to stop fighting no matter how many of them died. Vreth had lost 40% of his invasion force, and the soldiers who remained were exhausted and demoralized and terrified of every shadow. His supply lines were constantly disrupted by attacks that came from nowhere and vanished before his forces could respond. His ground commanders sent daily reports filled with casualties and failed operations and desperate pleas for reinforcement that he could no longer provide. The worst part was what was happening beyond. Earth-subject species across the Dominion were watching the humans resist, and whispers of rebellion were spreading through empires that had been obedient for centuries. If word got out that a single primitive species had fought the Vithric to a standstill, the entire Dominion might collapse. The message from the High Council arrived at midnight, and Vreth read it with something like relief. "Withdraw all forces from the human system immediately," it said, "and establish a permanent quarantine around their star. No Dominion vessel is to approach within 10 light years under penalty of death." The Council had decided to cut their losses and pretend that Earth had never existed. The evacuation took 3 days, and during those 3 days, the swarm attacked with renewed fury, as if they could sense that victory was finally within reach. Dropships loaded with retreating soldiers were shot down by weapons that humans had built in basements, and garages' supply convoys were ambushed by fighters who emerged from tunnels and ruins and forests. Like ghosts seeking vengeance, the Vithric losses in those final days were higher than in any week since the invasion began. When the last ship lifted off from Earth's surface, Hegemon Vreth gave one final order: seed the solar system with warning beacons in every language. The Dominion had encountered. The beacons would broadcast the same message for 1,000 years. "Do not approach this system. Do not contact the inhabitants. They are broken beyond repair and cannot be controlled." On the surface of Earth, Amara Okonkwo stood in the ruins of Geneva and watched the alien fleet break orbit and flee toward the stars around her. Humans emerged from hiding places that had kept them alive through a year of hell, from tunnels and basements and caves and sewers. They crawled into the light and looked up at the sky with eyes that had seen too much death. They had won, but the victory felt strange and hollow because everything they had known before the invasion was gone forever. The old world had died in those first terrible weeks, and the civilization that humanity had built over thousands of years was nothing but rubble and memory. Now governments no longer existed, and nations were just names on maps that nobody used anymore. Money was worthless, and the systems of trade and commerce that had connected the world were broken beyond repair. Half of humanity was dead, and the survivors were scarred in body and mind in ways that would never fully heal. But something new was growing in the cracks of the old world. The swarm had not disbanded. When the aliens left instead, it had evolved into something that was not quite a government, and not quite an army, but something entirely new. Humans still organized themselves into cells and networks that shared information and resources without any central authority telling them what to do. They had learned that cooperation did not require hierarchy, and they had learned that survival did not require submission. Scientists who had worked in secret during the occupation now emerged to share technology that could rebuild cities and grow food and heal the wounded. Engineers began constructing new systems for communication and transportation that were designed to survive. Any attack teachers gathered children who had grown up knowing nothing but war and began showing them a different way to live. Amara walked through the ruins and thought about everything that had happened and everything that was still to come. She had been a general once, part of a military structure that no longer existed. But she had found a new purpose in the swarm that felt more meaningful than anything she had done before. "We won," Captain Chun said beside her, and his voice carried wonder and exhaustion and grief all mixed together. "We survived," Amara corrected him. "And survival is not the same as winning, but it is enough for now." She looked up at the sky where the alien ships had disappeared, and she thought about the warning beacons that were broadcasting their message to the galaxy. "They think we are broken," she said. "And in a way, they are right. We broke under the weight of their invasion, and we will never be what we were before." She smiled despite the tears running down her face. But they do not understand that breaking is not the same as ending. And they do not understand that the cracks are where new things grow. In the years that followed, humanity rebuilt itself from the ruins of the old world. They did not recreate the nations and governments and systems that had failed them during the invasion. Instead, they built something new based on the lessons they had learned in fire and blood. Every human was a fighter now, trained from childhood to defend their species against any threat that might come from the stars. Every human was a scientist too, educated in the technologies that could protect their world and advance their civilization. And every human remembered what had happened when the aliens came, and they swore that they would never be caught unprepared again. The Vithric warning beacons continued broadcasting their message at the edge of the solar system. The inhabitants are broken beyond repair. But the humans who heard those words did not feel insulted. They felt proud. They had been broken. Yes, but they had broken in a way that made them stronger than they had ever been before. They had cracked, and the cracks had let in light that they had never seen before. And if anyone ever came to threaten Earth again, they would discover that broken humans were the most dangerous things in the galaxy. The war was over, but humanity's story was just beginning, and the stars that had once been the home of their enemies would someday become their inheritance. This was the legacy of the invasion. Not defeat and not victory, but transformation. Humanity had gone into the fire as one thing and emerged as something else entirely. They had been broken, and that had saved them, and nothing in the universe would ever break them again.